What is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that says the morally right action is the one that produces the greatest overall happiness or the least overall suffering for the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism can be based on the quantity of good provided or the quality of good provided. Now that you know what it is, let's talk about it. Utilitarianism has two main scholars, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Let's start with Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is seen as the godfather of utilitarianism. He was a quantitative utilitarianism, which basically means that he believed in providing the greatest amount or the greatest number of good for the greatest amount or number of people. Bentham was a hedonist. A hedonist is someone who prioritizes gaining as much pleasure as they can while avoiding as much pain as they can. Bentham actually believed that pleasure and pain were humanity's governing forces that determined our actions, and therefore our morality should be based on maximizing pleasure for as many people as possible and minimizing pain for as many people as possible. For example, let's say if you had a stack of 64 emeralds, you could split that into 2 stacks of 32 and give it to 2 villagers. Or you could split it into 4 stacks of 16 and give it to 4 villagers. Or you could go further and split it into 8 stacks of 8 and give it to 8 different villagers. But as you can see, the more you split that 64 stack of emeralds, the less that each new person gets. A person can do more with 64 emeralds instead of someone who has 8 emeralds. That's because with the 64 you have a lot more to spend, which means you can get a lot more resources from traders, for example, compared to 8. And it's due to issues like this, quantitative issues, that people might object to quantitative utilitarianism. One person who objected was his own follower, John Stuart Mill. Mill agreed with Bentham. He believed happiness was the ultimate goal of morality, just like he did, and he was also a hedonist, meaning he prioritized pleasure over pain. However, he felt like Bentham's approach was a little bit too simplistic, because what Bentham did was he saw different forms and different ways of getting pleasure as simply the same. So someone could have ice cream and someone could win the World Cup, and both those things accounted for 1 point of pleasure, if that's how you want to think of it. But Mill disagreed with this. He felt like there were certain pleasures or certain things we could do that would give us pleasure that were just inherently more pleasurable than others. So something as big as winning the World Cup would 100% be better than eating ice cream. This is where Mill makes a distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Higher pleasures to Mill are those that are intellectually gratifying, so education, literature, engaging in philosophy, or looking at or doing some sort of art. Whereas lower pleasures would be physical pleasures or sensory enjoyment, like watching a movie, or bodily gratification. You know what I mean. Now, although both quantitative and qualitative utilitarianism both have their benefits and reasons why they do sound reasonable, they do also have their drawbacks, which give very good reasons for why they can easily be objected to. An issue with Bentham's utilitarianism could be that it feels unreasonable to consider all pleasurable things as on the same level. For example, getting ice creams for 10 adults surely isn't on the same level as a trip to Disneyland for 5 kids. Another issue could be tyranny of the majority, where the pleasure of a group of people is prioritized because there are more of them than others who want a different kind of pleasure. For example, if there are 5 sadistic guards who receive pleasure from torturing a single prisoner. Quantitative utilitarianism would say that you should support the 5 sadistic guards, even though they're not doing something that's moral or ethical. For Mill's utilitarianism, there's the issue of pleasure being subjective. What gives me pleasure isn't always going to be what gives others pleasure. Someone who hates sports isn't going to find watching it as pleasurable as someone who loves it. An even better example would be something like me receiving pleasure from you subscribing, whereas you might not get pleasure from subscribing at all. And in that case, don't waste your time, I guess. Another issue is to do with higher and lower pleasures. Mill could be seen as biased and see as someone with access to education, philosophy, art, etc. But there are loads of less fortunate people in the world who don't have these and find pleasure in the simpler things that those of us who are fortunate take for granted, like seeing a clear sky instead of an ashy one, or being indoors when it rains. Qualitative utilitarianism kind of says that what gives the less fortunate in the world pleasure is less valuable. That seems wrong considering Mill has the privileged access to what he deems to be higher pleasures. Arguably, since not everyone has such access, or access to the same extent, it becomes harder to maximize pleasure for society, which would go against Mill. Also, just to add on, even among those of us who do have access to higher pleasures, some just don't find pleasure in them. Someone might not give a damn about art, but love sensory entertainment like movies and games. Mill has sort of an outdated view for what higher pleasures are, and it's pretty much just thrown a bunch of stuff that gets him going into that list to make him feel good. Another big issue with both of them is that they clash pretty easily. One focuses on quantity, one focuses on quality. Sometimes you just don't know which one you should prioritize, especially if you decide to stick to one, you might end up limiting yourself because you can't adjust to the other. And so I present to you the minecart problem, aka the trolley problem in normal people terms. Imagine if there was an out of control minecart on a track, where there are people tied down. You could let it send 5 people to the Shadow Realm, or you could pull a lever and divert the track so only one person gets sent there. Quantitative utilitarianism would obviously say pull the lever and save the 5 people, since those 5 will experience pleasure that outnumbers the 1. But this clashes with qualitative utilitarianism. What if you knew that the 5 people were murderers and the 1 was a doctor? With this information, you could then make perhaps the better choice of saving the doctor who would provide more pleasure for society. That decision would be good. But then again, saving the 5 murderers would ultimately be the greater number of people you could save in your current span of control. So perhaps that would be the good decision. All this confusion might lead you to question what you think you already know. And that is, what is good? Good can be happiness, usefulness, and a whole bunch of other things. It can be hard to define, and it really depends who you ask and the situation they're in. But, based on Bentham and Mill, good seems like pleasure. But is it? They're not exactly wrong. Pleasure means a lot to us. It's true that we want to feel pleasure and strive towards it, and it's also true that we don't like pain and want to avoid it. But is it correct to say that they're all that govern us? What about greed or fear? Emotions play a huge part in how we act. I'm sure you can think of times when you've behaved a certain way due to a certain emotion. Maybe you felt angry and lashed out, but then felt the displeasure of guilt afterwards, knowing that you wouldn't have lashed out if you hadn't gotten so angry. Or we could be governed by duty, a sense of obligation to do a certain thing based on maybe our job or our role. For example, a firefighter will run into a burning building to save those who are in there because it's his duty. He doesn't do it for his own pleasure. As a result, a lot of people disagree and think pleasure and pain are not our governing masters, and there's a lot more to it. And so I give you Nozick's experience machine. Robert Nozick was an American philosopher who came up with a thought experiment, meaning you think about it instead of actually doing a physical experiment, so it's more of a hypothetical. That was meant to refute hedonism. His experience machine thought experiment basically is as follows. Imagine if there was a powerful machine, maybe some kind of supercomputer, that an individual could hook themselves up to. It would be a one-time thing, meaning once they were in, they could never come out, kind of like the Matrix. But they would forget that they ever made the decision to enter in the first place. Once they were in, the machine could simulate their perfect life, meaning they could experience the most pleasure that they could ever want. The idea is, if we were completely governed by pleasure and pain, then people would jump at the chance to hook themselves up to the machine. But I'm sure some of you are thinking about it now and would prefer to stay in the life that you have, even if it's not playing out exactly the way you want it to. Nozick himself kind of saw this coming. He felt like people, despite knowing the powers of the machine to make you forget that you ever entered and therefore thinking that the simulation you were in was actually reality, would still choose to go against it, to live out your life despite however it may be going. I think we can all agree that there's something about the struggle of life, whether it's ideal, whether it's something that's easy to go through, that means more to us than simply being given stuff on a plate. A lot of people would much rather look back on a big journey that led them to where they are, so they can tell themselves that they worked hard for it, so they deserve to be there, rather than simply waking up one day and everything being exactly as you want. Now that's not to say that we don't want those good things to come to us and we want to struggle, but there's meaning behind that struggle. There's the beauty of knowing that we worked our backsides off to get to where we want to be, and that means a lot more to people than perhaps Bentham and Mill realize. And as a result, Nozick thinks no, most people would not be governed by pleasure and enter the machine. Instead, they'd rather put up with the pain of life and the inequalities or the misalignments of life that come with just being a normal human being that doesn't have everything go their own way. And there's something special about that means more to people than just simply having all the pleasures in the world given to them. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people out there who do seek solely pleasure and want to avoid pain, but most people would fight through it. Let me know what you think below. Do you think humanity is governed solely by pleasure and pain, or is there more to it? There are certain issues to mention, such as how we would go about calculating pleasure, which is responded to with the hedonic calculus. When in a situation, weigh up the intensity of pleasure, the duration, the certainty, the propinquity, meaning how soon the pleasure will occur, the fecundity, meaning whether it leads to more pleasure, purity, how free is it truly from pain or how much it avoids pain, and extent, how many people will get to experience that pleasure. A simple objection when in a situation where you don't have the time to weigh all that up, like if your partner or best friend or a family member was drowning alongside a doctor, is that you wouldn't give a damn about the calculus. You would immediately want to save any of the former rather than the random doctor. That's just how we are as humans. Plus, we can't predict consequences. How do we know that the doctor we save instead of our drowning family member, friend, partner, whoever, won't end up becoming some sort of madman that goes around infecting people with some crazy virus? We simply can't weigh up all the options, so if we do truly want to maximize the most pleasure, how can we? On top of that, utilitarianism is a bit flawed, because if we want to maximize pleasure for the most people as possible, then perhaps we ourselves would have to live a very feeble life. Instead of spending as much money as we do on food and clothes, we should donate more of our money and live rather frugally ourselves. But we don't want to do that. We want a bit of comfort because most of us have earned it by working. Among these issues, who knows if pleasure truly is the greatest good? Good might just be something defined entirely by the individual who seeks it. Whatever it is, it means a lot to us as people, and most of us care also about providing it for others. So, in a world where there are so many people trying to bring themselves and only themselves good and pleasure and some kind of gain, let's try and be a light that shines for others too. So now that I've told you all about utilitarianism, or perhaps not all about, but a good introduction to it, what do you think? Let me know in the comments what you think about utilitarianism and how useful it really is. Just a little bit of extra cherry on the top. You got to consider how helpful utilitarianism has been for humanity. It underpins a lot of parts to do with how we function, such as public healthcare, economics, government policies, charity, and even stuff like AI and climate change. A lot of conversations to do with those have a lot to do with utilitarianism and the overall good for society. So let me know, what do you think? Other than that, I just want to say thanks so much for watching this video and giving it a chance. If you enjoyed it, then feel free to leave a like and subscribe, since that would be pretty utilitarian, depending on who you're asking. But more importantly, it would mean the world to me. I also have a TikTok and Instagram where I've uploaded and will continue to upload shorts on smaller dilemmas and issues, so if there's anything you want me to talk about on those, or show on those, or even talk about on this channel, then feel free to let me know in the comments, and also feel free to have a discussion amongst yourselves. I'll try pop down myself and talk about a few things. All the best, take care, and see you next time on the next MC Philosopher Production.